I was saying, mainly you make these changes and improvement based on the results of an internal audit process, for example, for the, mainly for the indicators results. So it's very important to understand this process. This is not this is not only a plan, this is a process that starts with establishing, then you implement, then you monitor and review, then you maintain and review, but then you have to review if the context and the scope have not changed, if the planning of the risk have not changed, vulnerabilities, threat, controls. You have to permanently understand if the support tools are correct. You have to train, you have to make the people aware of the risks. And then again, if there are changes here, there will be changes in the operation. And also, if you change operation, you have maybe you have another audit process, you have another dashboard, you have another key performance indicators, and then with these results, you again improve, and this is a life cycle. You as an auditor, you have to assure that this is a process, a live process. Otherwise, the information security is not a management system, is a management photograph, but not a live system. It's very important for the auditor to really assure that the organization is performing this life cycle. Focusing on process, of course, this is very known, but it's very important to focus on the main activities of the organization and to also assure that the controls implemented in those activities are really in place. If these controls are not in place, everything else will not be in place for the information security. And the risk, you can never ignore the risk. You can trace the risk, you can accept the risk, you can outsource the risk, you can do various different things with it, but you can never ignore risks. Okay, so with this, we finish this introduction of what is information security and what is the perspective of information security. Is very, very important for the auditor to understand what is information security. You cannot audit a company about information security if you don't know about information security. You have to know about the main principles. You have to know about the standards. You have to know about risks. You have to know about controls. You have to be prepared to understand what you are auditing. That's why I use this first hour to introduce information security. Now, let's go quickly to the second part of this webinar, is about principles, audit principles. And a few standards that we are going to mention ISO 19011 is this standard contains guidelines and support related to audit methods. This is not mandatory. You are not compelled to use this standard, but it's a very interesting standard to follow during an audit process. That's why I mentioned this standard is a very good guidelines for auditors' qualifications. The other standard I quickly mentioned, this is requirement for bodies providing management system audit and certification. This ISO 17021 is assigned to be used by organizations that audit and certified management systems. You know, the management system is audited by organizations and they must follow these good practice guidelines. Just only to mention these two standards and to keep them in mind. So what is an audit? It's a very simple answer. It's a systematic, independent, and documented process for obtaining audit evidence and evaluating it to measure the extent to which audit criteria are met. So, what is mainly when you audit, you ask people what they are doing, and then you have to check if what they told you is really in place. If they have the documentation, but if they have the evidence that they are performing what they say they are performing. This is as simple as this, but it's very important to understand what I'm going to do in the audit process. And also I mentioned here audit criteria. Audit criteria is to what I'm going to compare the activities. In an internal audit process, the audit criteria are the policies, the procedures, the processes that the people in the organization must follow. And you as an auditor have to understand if they are following this audit criteria. In a certification, an ISO certification process, the audit criteria is the ISO standard. You are going to audit is the company has an information security management system that complies with ISO 27001. That is the audit criteria. There are different types, as I mentioned, of audits. Internal audits, sometimes called first-party audit, is the what I mentioned before, independent and objective activity that they give the organization assurance about the level of control over their operation. It's very related with risk. You have to inform the executive committee if the company is running risks that you ignore. So this is the objective of the first party audit. Then we can talk about what we call second party audits. Second party audits are performed by parties who have an interest in the audited organization, such as a customer. When our client audits our organization, they want to know if we are running risks because they want to be our customer. They are going to buy our service or our products. Or maybe we audit a third party, an organization, to be a supplier. We want to have non-risky suppliers. So we can audit, a second party audit is to audit another organization, in this case, a supplier. And the third party audit is when an organization is audited by an independent organization. These audits are performed by external independent organization, for example, to grant a certificate of conformity with a management system. Okay, these are the types of audits. What are the principles, the main principles? Here I'm invoking this standard, clause number 4 of this standards, the 6 main principles, fundamental principles of the audit that must be taken into account at all times by the auditors during the audit process. These principles refer to integrity, the integrity that the auditor has to perform, the fair presentation about what he is looking for. You are not looking, when you audit, you are not looking for wrong things. You are looking for compliance. you are looking is if the organization has a process that complies, that mostly complies with the audit criteria. That is what you are looking for. And if you know about the theme that you are auditing, it's much better to understand if really the organization is compliant. That means fair presentation. You are not looking for non-conformities. Non-conformities are a consequence, but it's not the objective of the auditor. The objective is to look for compliance. To preserve professional care, that means you have to be a professional at all time. You have to follow your professional ideas, and you have to be very professional that facing your customer, in this case, the auditee. Confidentiality, very, very important. You are going to go into a lot of confidential information, sensitive information. You are going to see the processes. You are going to find weaknesses in the organization. So that information is absolutely confidential. You cannot share that information with nobody, professionally nor personally. You cannot use that information for any other situation but the audit process. The independence principle, very important. You cannot have any relationship with the auditor. That means a good or a bad relationship. If you have a previous bad relationship, you cannot audit. If you have a personal relationship, familiar or friendship or any other economical interest, you cannot audit. And the sixth principle of these main six principles is the evidence base. You as an auditor always need evidence. You cannot raise a non-conformity because you suppose that is happening or that is not happening. You have to have evidence. The evidence is the main thing that the auditor has to look for. No evidence, no non-conformity. No evidence, no non-conformity. Also, you have to look for evidence not only for a non-conformity. You have to look for evidence to a conformity. I have to have evidence that this organization is in compliance with clause number 6, and I had to look for evidence. This is a very, very important principle, evidence. Okay, these are the 6 main principles that ISO 19011 presents for us in an audit process. Now then, I said before that evidence is very, very important. Let's talk about the 2 evidence approach, the evidence-based and risk-based audit approach. This is you have to establish previously when you are in the previous meeting with the company that are going to audit, you have to establish what evidence, what approach of evidence you are going to use. What is an evidence? First of all, here, clause 3.3 of this ISO standard. An evidence is all information used by the auditor to determine whether the organization or the audited data that you are looking follows the established criteria. A policy, as I said, a policy is an evidence. A list of assets with their owners is an evidence of what they are having. A process of assigning owners to the assets. An internal audit report is also an evidence that the company has an internal audit process. the observation of a working process is a very important evidence. You are observing, you are seeing what is happening. You may take notes, you may take records. It's a very important evidence what you are looking. A photo of a room, for example, with servers, a film, a video, all of those evidence. We are going to talk about some evidence in next slides. This audit evidence must be verifiable. And this audit evidence can be qualitative or quantitative. Of course, qualitative evidence comes from the analysis of an unquantified characteristic of information. For example, an interview with an internal audit manager with the internal audit procedures manual is an evidence to validate that this company has an internal audit process that meet the requirements of the ISO clause 9.2. But it's a qualitative evidence. But this is a really useful evidence. Now, a quantitative evidence, it comes from, for example, when I analyzing a sample of information related to some criteria or some output of a machine. For example, if I analyze 5 of the 100 reports of non-compliance, non-conformities declared, this is a quantitative evidence, a portion of the quantitative evidence. Then you have to determine if that 5% is a representative evidence. That's another problem. But this is very quantitative. It's a concrete evidence. So very important to understand is evidence-based approach, what you are going to use. When you are an evidence-based audit approach, it's a rational approach, of course, and to formulate a reliable conclusion. Then you have to establish conclusions of that audit. The auditor's conclusion should always be based on sufficient and adequate evidence. What is an adequate evidence? It has to be reliable, it has to be relevant. As I said before, in the absence of evidence, the auditor cannot conclude whether or not an audit criteria fits. So in order to present adequate and sufficient evidence, the auditor must gather objective evidence of the information available in the audit and evaluate the objectively if that evidence is really reliable. We talk about reliability of the evidence. In general terms, the more objective and external to the organization is an evidence, the more reliable it will be considered. For example, a verbal evidence may be reliable or not. It's an evidence, yes. You must collect an evidence, yes, but you cannot conclude an evidence or a process only with a verbal evidence. Then you may look for a documentary evidence. A documentary evidence is complete itself? No, because you may have a document, but then you have to verify. You can tell me that you have a document, verbal evidence. You can show me the document, documentary evidence, but that doesn't guarantee that you have the process. You have then to look for another evidence, technical, analytical, confirmatory evidence, somebody external that can confirm by, for example, an external auditor that the perspective measures documented in the, for example, in the quality management system are effective. Technical evidence, checking the configuration, for example, of an antivirus management console to validate the update process is a very good technical evidence. Somebody told me that they did, and then I checked with the technical evidence. I can conclude. They told me that they performed. I saw a technical evidence. I really can conclude that the process is in place. So you have to gather all this evidence? No, definitely no. You have to analyze if the reliability of the evidence when you conclude that the evidence that you have gathered is reliable, just to confirm that the audit criteria has been satisfied, then you stop there. When do you have to stop? This is part of your, as an auditor, your qualification, your capacity. But you have to keep in mind this slide. You have to gather different types of evidence. So, as I said, the evidence must be appropriate. What means appropriate? First of all, enough, but then relevant and reliable. The reliability is very important. The quality of the information that guarantees that is reasonably free from errors. That's what reliable means in this process. And the main factors influencing the reliability of the tests, well, the objectivity of the evidence. The evidence, as I said, is more reliable if it is considered objective, of course. It speaks for itself without any interpretation. Not always we are going to find this type of evidence. The timeless of evidence. The evidence is the most reliable if it is possible to obtain warranties that the tests are applied at the indicated time. For example, a postage stamp, a transaction record on a computer that says time, hours, minute, date. This is very concrete. It gives a lot of reliability, this timeless evidence. The independence of the source also. Evidence is more reliable if it has been produced by an independent third party. For example, a customer, a report from an external company, an audit report, an invoice, collection of evidence. The auditor should consider the qualifications of the person providing the test and the collection techniques used to collect that evidence. The internal control system. When an internal control system is effective, an auditor may rely on a set of compensation controls, for example, to assess the effectiveness of a control that is considered less reliable. That must help. Okay, the other approach is a risk-based approach of auditing. We define 3 stages. The inherent risk. The inherent risk is correspond to the possibility that without taking into account the internal control that may exist in the organization, a significant defect occurs in the management system. Is the risk related for the, for example, the industrial sector in which the organization is working, operates? The risk control, the risk that a major defect cannot be prevented or detected by a control. This also happens not all the controls, detect risks. This may happen. And the third risk is that the risk that an auditor will not be able to detect a material defect during an audit. This must happen because it's very difficult to be detected, or the auditor has not chosen the correct process to detect an error. Well, these are some considerations that you have to consider when you are going to establish what approach you are going to use for the audit process. A very important definition is materiality. When we talk about audit, this concept originates mainly in the field of accounting, when financial auditors usually measure materiality in monetary terms, because they are auditing monetary terms. In a case of an information security process, the material or the materiality is defined in the main process, the main activities of the organization. So you have to agree before performing the audit process that where are you going to focus in the materiality processes you are going to focus. And information is considered material if its omission or false statement may influence the decision of interest party on the basis of the statement of the audited organization. This is very important to understand what the stakeholders consider material for the organization, because that must be on the scope of the information security management system. And factors to consider, as I said, well, criticality of the process, the cost of the system, material, software, licenses, fees, a combination of all them, the cost of operation, people, third-party services, commissions, the cost of errors, potential cost of error for a non-conformity, a customer that claims something, a warranty claim, unrecoverable development costs. Well, you have to then put in place this cost, the main cost. Number of transactions or affected, or resources affected. The service level agreement, the conditions of service level agreements, and the cost of possible penalties in case of non-compliance with the SLAs. Sanctions in case they don't comply with legal, regulatory, or contractual conditions. So these are the concepts that you have to agree. You are going to focus on these material processes. It's very important, mainly in a big organization. Where are you going to focus? Okay. The audit process now, these are the main steps of the audit process. Start of the audit, the first stage, prepare for the second stage, the second stage, the conclusion and the review. This is the usual process of an audit. Let's go through these steps. The first point, you start of the audit process. You have a first meeting with the organization you are going to audit to understand what you are going to audit, and then you have to start constructing your team. You have to gather your audit team. That you, this audit team are going to be responsible for plan the audit, manage communication with the client, lead the audit team, resolve conflict. It's very important, this appointment of the audit team, the audit team leader, because he or she is going to be your face in that organization. Then establish an initial contact with the auditee for better understand, to establish the to setting communication channels, to understand the audit objectives, to introduce the audit team. You are going to request access, for example, to relevant documentation. You are going to agree security levels. You are going to make their logistical arrangements. You understand about if there are going to be need to have observers or guides during the audit. All these previous this previous concern must be established in this initial contact. Then number 4, you have to validate the audit objectives. The management system is in accordance with what standard the organization has implemented that management system. Okay, it has maintained, it has an improvement process. You know, you have to first validate if the audit is possible. If you don't comply with some main objectives, you cannot audit. So this is very important to establish these first main steps. Then the audit scope. You know that the management system is not necessary to have a complete scope. You can define a partial scope, but you have to have a very clear scope because you are going to focus on that scope. Of course, this scope is very related with the previous concept of materiality. The scope must include that material processes. Otherwise, the scope is not correctly defined. Validate the audit criteria. We are going to use ISO 27001. What version? Now we have 2 versions. What version are you going to use? Today, you can still use the previous version. No, I want to use the new version. Okay, you have to define what audit criteria, not only the ISO, but politics, other standards, laws and regulations, very important that you have to comply, contracts, commercial contracts. Then determine the audit feasibility. If the organization has sufficient information provided, if they have to establish adequate cooperation. And also you have to take into consideration cultural aspects, mainly if you're working in another country, in a very different culture, in a very different language. You have to agree some very important points because we are humans and the human relations are very, very important during an audit process. And the last step is the selection of the audit team. Once you have understand all these aspects and you can confirm this audit team leader, you now have to select your audit team, mainly considering all the previous points as I have mentioned before. The second stage of this process is the first stage of or stage 1 of the audit. Here, this first stage of the audit process is where you as an audit team gather all the information, all the documentation of the management system. You may also have a previous visit to evaluate locations, conditions, environment conditions of the locations, a first meeting to know each other, to understand the other side of the company, but mainly collect information about the documentation of the management system. If they don't have a correct documentation, you cannot continue with the process. You may raise a non-conformity in this stage, and you have to give time for the organization to correct. For example, this is a document, it's some information is missing, it's a minor non-conformity. We need to correct this document. You have to give the opportunity to the organization to correct that document. Then collect the information, agree with the audit details for the stage 2. The stage 2 of the audit is where you go to the organization and you are going to validate and collect evidence, but you have the documental evidence. You are going to collect another type of evidence: verbal evidence, technical evidence, mathematical evidence, confirmatory evidence, other types of evidence. The documental evidence, you have it. Now you collect it in this first stage. Then the second stage audit is the most important stage. Here you are going to confirm is what all these documents say you are doing, you are really performing. So this stage two of the audit is the management system complies with all the requirements of the standard. You are going to have the standard in the audit criteria in hand, and you are going to validate if they are compliant, if they are effectively implemented, and if really what you are going to see in this stage 2 allows the organization to achieve objectives of the information security management system. Here I have some examples of information collection that may be useful. I mean, records, logs, the records of access to a server, for example, to a server room, with a magnetic card, the registration of visitors, all those records are important for the auditor. Documents, policies, software installation procedures, an employee handbook, reports from other sources, all documents that you have not received in stage 1. These are particular documents, not the management system documents, particular documents that may help you to understand if a practice is really in place. Interviews with a network administrator, with the help desk, with an operator. Database and websites, maybe the databases of the employees, to understand if they are accomplished with the training program or the awareness program, or if they have the correct access to the information. For example, indicators, an indicator panel, a dashboard, mainly with security incidents, security factors, controls, efficiency of controls, incidents that are registered, system configuration, system setting, a firewall, a server, the antivirus console, the DLP, data leakage prevention console. This is very concrete evidence, because when you see, for example, the configuration of a file, you really know what may go to the other side or not. And, well, remarks, any observation that you can do in the server room, for example, any observation that is remarkable for you. Which is the relationship of audit evidence to appropriate procedure? This step is the heart of the audit in terms of importance and duration, because the collection of information, the audit team collects information, a lot of information during the process. Then testing with appropriate procedures. You have gathered a lot of information of evidence, but you have to use some procedures such as observation, document review, interviews, as I mentioned before. But you have to classify all that evidence that you collected and the way that you collected, so to have a correct record about if this is a strong evidence or not. And the third parties corroborate and evaluate all that evidence to really define if a clause, if a control, if a policy is really in compliance or not. Writing, funding, and non-conformities. As I said before, the non-conformity is not the objective of the auditor. The objective is the compliance, but the auditor must evaluate with all that audit evidence and the audit criteria to issue audit findings. An audit finding may indicate a conformity or a lack of conformity. A finding is that I found that you comply with this criteria. That is a conformity. And a lack of conformity is when you have evidence that some criteria is not compliant. The auditor should identify these points of compliance using the audit criteria, the locations, the functions, the processes that were audited, and in that case, then start defining the non-conformities. Okay, now we are running a bit short of time. Let me talk about some audit procedures and test plans to collect the appropriate evidence. To ensure that a control is in place, the auditor must, as I said, gather information from different sources and objectively evaluate that information and also evaluate the source where they gather the information. The evidence collection can be done using different audit procedures or different methods, and sometimes using sampling. When we use sampling, when the population is too big, I cannot analyze every member of the population, so I have to use sampling. Sampling is required because otherwise I cannot audit. And it's very important to use the correct sampling method. That must be a risk. If you don't use a representative part of the population, your conclusions are going to be partial. Okay, with all this information, you have to evaluate, as I said before, evaluate all this information against the criteria and then produce your finding. As I said, findings from both sides, a compliance finding and non-compliance finding. After that, we have to a revision of the findings to be absolutely sure that the findings are correct, and then the conclusions of the audit. There are procedures, evidence collection and analysis procedures of the evidence. Auditors use these procedures to gather evidence in enough quantity, sufficient quantity to validate the compliance of the clause of the management system. Using these audit procedures is a systematic manner that reduces audit risk. If you use a good procedure, the risk of the audit comes down. And you also reinforce the auditor's objectivity. Mainly, the auditor typically uses a combination of evidence collection procedure to create the audit evidence. This is what we call a test plan. We have several audit procedures that the auditor can use to collect evidence, but they have to make a plan to gather information, enough information of this compliance or non-compliance clause. You have to design a test plan. The most commonly audit procedures are observation, when I directly observe what is doing a process and I take my notes. I may take a photograph if I am allowed to do so, or I can take conclusions. After the observation, I can combine with technical verification. I observe the procedure and then I gather information from a firewall, a server, a sniffer, a tool. Is a very concrete evidence. Document review, as I said, interviews, as also said, and then I have to analyze the procedure, analyze the information, analyze the document with the interview if they match. Well, these are the main procedures to collect evidence. And then these categories are not exclusive. You can use them as you wish. These are the main. And then you have to analyze, corroborating and evaluating, maybe with a subject matter expert, if you need so, with another auditor, with a team leader, to really analyze, corroborate, and evaluate if the evidence is enough to determine a compliance or a non-compliance. It's frequently used, the sampling process, when you have great volumes, as I said before, and you have to make a sampling plan to collect the correct information. So first, you have to define the population. For example, all the changes of an application carried out during a period of time, 1 month. Then you have to determine the sampling method. There are different sampling methods depending of the information you have about the population, and this is very critical process to define the correct sampling method. Then you have to determine the sampling size that represents the population. Then you have to execute the sampling plan, choosing with this sampling method some records and assuming that records that you are choosing with the sampling method that you are using is a representative from the population. And then you have to evaluate the results and conclude that with that information, conclude the compliance or non-compliance of the process. I mentioned risk errors, sampling risk errors, risk related to the sampling. There are, for example, if an error occurs because the data collected is is collected from a part of the population that is not representative, for example, of the entire population. I am assuming that this sample is representative, but it is not. It will be a difference between the calculated estimate derivative from that data and the real value. This is one of the risks. So it's very important to choose, first of all, to understand the population. When you understand the population, you have to choose the correct method of sampling. What happens if you do not know the population? Well, you have to choose more big samples because the error may go higher. And the other type of errors is the risk on errors related to the auditor. There are some factors. For example, if the auditor proves a poor safety check by checking the approval of a change, instead of reviewing the initial approval, the initial process, this is an error from the auditor. If the auditor selects the first points of the year, for example, on a list, instead of selecting a sample from the entire population, this is an error from the auditor who selects the sample. Okay, you have to consider that these methods of sampling may have risk, and you have to assume that risks. I mentioned these internal audit plans. You have to, these are four steps that I propose you to create an audit plan. This audit plan, when you have to collect information in different types. For example, prepare audit verification plans. In most cases, there are several applicable and valid audit test procedures to validate a clause or a control. So you, as an auditor, must develop this test plan by selecting the appropriate and valid test for each clause and each control. Use of a combination of procedures maybe is recommended, especially when the first audit procedure is in an interview. An oral test is usually not considered as sufficient evidence. So then you have to, they may be your first point, but then you have to add other procedures. Assess the quality and sufficiency of the evidence. The auditor should assess the most appropriate types of procedures to verify these audit criteria. In the absence of more evidence, you must obtain evidence that is still valid, but of low quality. And this is an alarm. The low quality evidence may conduce to a risk, to an error, sorry, not to a risk. And the fourth recommendation is group the test procedure. You should always try to group these testing procedures for the same person, for example. First of all, to avoid multiple meetings, and also to not to be disruptive in operations. It's very important not to interfere in the process on the operations of the company. These are some recommendations to create an audit plan. Okay, now let's talk about these facts, very important facts that are part of the conclusion of the audit process. These are the findings. So what is a finding? Are the results of the evaluation of the collected evidence against the audit criteria. We have talked about that. The findings are the results of comparing the evidence with the criteria. And always remember that findings indicate compliance or non-conformity. You need evidence for compliance. You need evidence for non-compliance. You always need evidence. It is very important. A solid audit process needs evidence. Types of audit findings. There are these types of audit findings. A conformity, it means that with the evidence you have collected, all aspects of the requirement are fulfilled, so are met. So this clause is under compliance. An observation. An observation is a situation during the audit that is not a non-conformity, but it needs follow-up. Maybe an observation is not considered a non-conformity, but maybe the first step to be analyzed in the next process. A non-conformity, a minor non-conformity, is a situation, a non-compliance with an aspect of a requirement with a not very big risk. A non-compliance with one aspect of a requirement was not met, and one aspect. When the non-conformity is a total fail of a clause, or is a very big risk, and it really is not showing the effectiveness of a clause, that is a major non-conformity. And a major non-conformity means not a non-recommendation for certification before this major non-conformity is solved. Okay. To document the audit findings, you have to balance between evidence and criteria. Previous of closing the session, the auditor should confer on the completion of the review of the findings and any other information collected during the audit. Any information in the audit notes must be take into consideration to define these audit findings. It is always an act of judgment from the auditor. He must consider the evidence, he must consider the relevance and the reliability, as I said, of the evidence, and the sufficiency of the evidence of the evidence related to an audit criteria. So it's very important here to understand what are the boundaries between this minor non-conformity. Mainly, when it's a major non-conformity, okay, it's very clear. But what is the boundary for a minor non-conformity? One can agree that a finding is compliant if an auditor observes one transaction in 1,000 that did not meet the requirement. One in 1,000, it's reasonable that it complies. What happens when 800 of transactions do not meet from 1,000? It's a major non-compliant. What happens when you find 20, 30, 40? What happens there? It's a minor non-conformity, maybe, but maybe in that case, you have to look for more evidence because it's in the boundary. And when you have to defend as an auditor your finding and your non-conformity, you have to be very solid defending that non-conformity. So in this case, maybe you may have to look for more evidence, confirmatory or non-confirmatory. But it's a situation where you need help in that case. Another practice that is very relevant is the quality review by your peers. When we are auditing a big company, we have many auditors, it's a good practice that before issuing the final report, my papers as an auditor are reviewed by another. My non-conformity, my conclusions are reviewed by another auditor. This is what we call the peer review, because it ensures compliance with the procedures by all the team members. So this is very important procedure to review from a third party before issuing the final report. And the leader of the audit team must verify that all the members have followed good audit practices and established procedures. Very important that all the members have done this. That all the evidence collected is appropriate, reliable, and sufficient. That the findings are based on solid evidence, very solid evidence. As I said before, if you are not sure, or you look for more evidence, or you must not establish a finding there, but you have to be solid. And the problems encountered were solved. All the problems found during the process are solved. This is the quality review done by the leader in the overall process, not only between auditors, but the overall process must comply with this. And the last step, the audit closure. Okay, this is a summary of the events that may take place between the audit team and the auditee during the closing, the closing of the audit. For example, the auditor established his audit findings after having assessed all the evidence and all the processes we have mentioned, and presents his non-conformities. The auditee may confirm that conclusion or may provide additional information if he or she is satisfied with the findings or not. You know that the auditee must accept the findings. They may, in this case, provide more information. The next step, the auditor issues the conclusions of the audit and his recommendations, or not, for the certification. It then presents the findings to the organization management. All these findings, the audit has to be accepted by the representative of the auditee. Then the auditor formally presents the conclusions and recommendations during the closing meeting and delivers the reports of the stage 2 of the audit process. The auditee accepts or may appeal the final audit report. Generally, they accept because all this has been previously agreed. Then the certification recommendation requires as the auditee should submit action plans, no, closing or the action plans for those non-conformities. The auditor evaluates the action plan submitted and follow up during the next follow-up audit process, or as depending on the type of non-conformities, in a new audit process. Then the auditee implements the corrective or preventive actions proposed in the plans. The auditor must validate on-site these conclusions, and then after the initial audit, the auditor shall conduct follow-up audits during this second and third years for certification. This is mainly what the process a summary of the events that happened during this audit closure. After all this process, the audit follow-up. As an integral part of initial audit process, the follow-up activities should be planned in the same capacity as the other measures required for the execution of the audit. The objective is to validate that the action plans submitted by the audited entity and the corrective measures that have already been implemented are conformity again. If there are major non-conformities, the organization must resolve them before being recommended for the certification. If there are minor non-conformities, maybe they are solved during the next process. And evaluating the evaluation of the action plans by the auditor, if management, after analysis, decide that it accepts the risk, than rather implementing corrective, preventing, or improvement action, this must be documented and justified. You may accept that risk because you are not going to implement these actions, but you have to document these justifications. The action plans must be submitted within the specified deadlines. Most certification bodies set a deadline from 10 to 60 days for the submission of these action plans. If the action plans are not received within the specified time period, the auditee will not be recommended for the certification. And an auditor should always remember that the organization is very unlikely to deliver on all improvement at the same time. Each improvement requires the use of resources and requires time for implementing. So these action plans may be prioritized by the management, especially when they need investment. So the auditor will need to ensure that the improvement targets are realistic based on the particular context of this entity. Verbal responses may be received by the auditor and should be recorded later. And the auditor should, well, I said that that is very important. Based on the experience of the auditor, they should assess whether an action plans are appropriate and mainly address the root cause. The root cause is one of the most important parts of the continual improvement of the organization. So this is a main step of the action plans, the root cause identification and solution of the root cause. Okay, we have gone through these steps on the proposed process of an audit, and this is the step that the 6 steps that we recommend for an audit process. And thank you so much for your attention.